This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Covel. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guests today, back-to-back interviews, are the co-authors of a book called Rich as a King: How the Wisdom of Chess Can Make You a Grandmaster of Investing. Susan Polgar, an American chess grandmaster, and Douglas Goldstein, certified financial planner, had the unique idea of looking at chess and applying the wisdom to investing. Now, of course, for me, this is really interesting, even though I'm not a chess player, because one of the criteria, one of the things that Richard Dennis and Bill Eckhart were looking for back in the day when they were doing their turtle experiment were chess players. Susan has a fantastically interesting background, Hungarian-born American chess grandmaster. There are not many of them. I think she says in the interview around 1,500 total. Was a child prodigy and has won just about everything there is to win. And to hear her recollect the stories of her as a 4-year-old beating grown men in chess, just fascinating. The lessons that we can all learn from the way that she thinks, the way that she looks at the world, the way that she figured out how to master chess. Insightful. I hope you enjoyed these conversations with Susan Polgar and Douglas Goldstein.
Hi, how are you?
Hey, Susan, how are you?
Good.
So I have to tell you, you're my first chess grandmaster on my podcast. I'm privileged. Thank you for taking a little time today. I got to jump right in. You have a fascinating story. I've done a little bit of reading up on you, and I really want to know, because I think your memory goes back a while. As a 4-year-old girl being introduced to chess, and you start to, very early on, I believe even as a 4-year-old, start to beat, and correct me if I'm wrong, start to beat older men. Tell me, when did you first realize how unique this skill was that you were developing, not only from the standpoint of the chess skill, but from the standpoint of a girl's not supposed to do this?
Well, actually, I realized it quite early because of the strange behavior of men that I thought at the time that, they had real trouble accepting losing to a young girl. And that continued actually for a number of years, not just when I was 4 years old, but even when I was later 6, 8, 10, or 12 years old. It took them a while until they kind of got used to the idea that, yes, it's not that shameful to lose to a girl, and it's like losing a game against anybody else. But indeed, when I was just 4 years old or very young, it was really a culture shock, I think, for men, for boys. I mean, for most people, because 4 is really young. But even the fact that a girl or a woman would beat men in chess at the time was a foreign thought. And for me, as a young girl, not knowing any better, I didn't understand why. It's not like we're lifting weights or we have to race on a track field. So why couldn't a woman be as good than a man? And that kind of became kind of the whole theme of my life, as it turned out.
So go back to that early starting period. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say there's a combination of nurture and nature, a combination of DNA and practice. Is that how you view it?
It is always a combination, obviously. The question is, what is the ratio? I think me as well as my family, we tend to stand on the side of the group that believes that ratio is very, very heavily on the side of the nurture versus the nature, versus some other people, other groups that think maybe the reversed or a different balance of it.
Why don't you talk a little bit more about that? Because that is fairly controversial. A lot of people want to attribute success to the DNA. Now, clearly, you've had two sisters, very successful. One, I believe, has a higher ranking a higher score than you even, and is a grandmaster today. Talk about the nurture part of it and what you learned from your parents and your father.
First of all, it starts out with the work ethic and the discipline. So obviously that's a questionable issue. Is that a talent? That you have the motivation, you have the willingness, the desire to work hard in order to achieve high-level results. So that is a debate that right there, right? If that itself is a talent. But beyond that, my father, who is a psychologist, he strongly believes and wrote a book on the subject that it could have been pretty much any field, whether it's mathematics or music or other fields that we would have focused on, the success could have been of equal level. We chose chess partly because I accidentally discovered the game and liked it, but also because of practical reasons, that it's a pretty low cost thing compared to a number of other things. And it was just convenient that you can buy a chess set for a few dollars and it lasts for a lifetime, and you can do it at home or outside or on the bus or anywhere you are. So it's from the practical perspective. But the ability, so to say, we believe that any healthy born child has a potential genius.
But your father must have had some very special techniques that maybe other people weren't using. Maybe they knew about them, they were lazy or whatnot, but your father introduced to you techniques or ways of thinking or ways of dealing with the world that in hindsight must feel unique as an older in life to look back and say, my gosh, my father really had some cool insights when I was a young girl.
Definitely. He was a visionary. He was ahead of his time. He's still alive, of course. So although he doesn't work as much as he used to, obviously he's retired now. But yeah, he definitely was ahead of his time in various ways, in the nature nurture aspect, but also with the man against women aspect as well. I'm very thankful for him for that, obviously, that he gave me the opportunity and he stood up for what he believed in. And at the time, it was not quite a social norm, our lifestyle or our beliefs.
Let me ask you, because you mentioned right early on in our conversation how much the notion of being a woman ultimately still in I've seen you describe it as a man's world. The competition part, how much were you driven? How much was there an internal drive related to the idea that you were a woman beating men in their sport, in their world? How much did that drive you?
Well, I think actually thanks to the reaction of men from early on, it kind of subconsciously developed in me that special drive that let me prove them wrong. In a way, it felt good that all the disbelievers had no choice but to recognize that they were wrong.
I am somebody who as a kid played a little bit of chess. I've not looked at a board in a long time, and I'm sure I'm like many people, and I'm sure there's plenty of people in my audience that do play and are very interested to hear what you have to say. But can you define for the audience out there, those with some experience and those that are not, and I'm not asking you to brag because it's a matter of fact that you reached the level of Grandmaster. Can you try and put that into some context for us lay people of where that stands skill-wise, even if we're not chess players? Maybe they make a comparison or analogy to something else so we can have an idea of where that level of achievement exists and the kind of effort that it took to get there.
Well, obviously, it's a tremendous effort in the history of the game. I think that there is less than 1,500 people who ever got there. And there are today, there are various estimates, but somewhere between 600 million to 1 billion people who play chess just today. Out of that, in the history of the game, since they award Grandmaster titles, which is about 100 years, only 1,500 people, men or women, ever accomplished that. And I was the first woman ever to do so. In a way, it's a big thing. I'm very proud of being a pioneer for women to show that, yes, it's possible, because when I was growing up, it was clearly the belief for everybody, including the top women players, that it's simply impossible. women are built differently. Women are incapable of achieving that. And I was really puzzled and disturbed, honestly, that my fellow women, they didn't believe it. I understood that men, maybe many of them or some of them, were chauvinistic or prejudiced or whatever you want to say. But even the women thought that I and my family were crazy, believing that it's possible. And that's what really puzzled me and in a way bothered me. And I wanted to prove the world wrong but why not? Right? I mean, why couldn't a woman be as competitive in a field that's intellectual, such as chess, as men are? Well, it's a nice justification that I managed to prove that, and then my sister Judith followed it as well. And today there are more than 24 women who have accomplished that feat by now.
So it's interesting you bring up not only the competition with men, but the defeatist attitude with women. That's interesting that you were driven by both. Your fellow women that were thinking, "Oh, you can't do this in a men's world." Then you were driven against the men who were like, "Hey, she can't beat us."
Yeah, well, I'm glad that I showed the road, but I think, of course, it goes well beyond chess, because chess is not the only male-dominated field in our society, and I think it's an example for girls out there in other male-dominated fields like sciences or etc., where also there are very few women, and I think it's important that they see examples in their own fields or similar fields that, yes, it's doable.
Hey, let me ask one more question about kind of the setup and the family structure before I get into some of the concepts, some of the work that was in the book. Your sister, you mentioned Judith, a grandmaster today, a higher ranking or score than you, a lifetime. How about sibling rivalry? Was there ever that there, or was it always mutually supportive?
Well, actually, I'm quite a bit older than Judith, so it started out me changing her diapers and teaching her. Clearly, in addition to siblings, it was like a teacher-student relationship for a long time. I was already a master-level player, practically when she just started out playing, learned how the pieces move. Eventually, obviously, I retired much earlier than she did. She just retired a few months ago. I was much ahead of her just by because I'm elder. And then eventually as a coach, actually, I'm very, very proud of her that she was my first success story as a coach. It was just natural, and I was very happy for her when she surpassed me after many years.
Mm. Let me relay a quick story. So one of my books was about a very famous story, two traders, very successful in the early 1980s. So successful, they decided to hire some trainees. And when they went to find trainees, one of the things that they were looking for was chess players. And they did hire several chess players. And this trader trainee program became very famous, very successful. A lot of money was made. Talk to me from your perspective about chess and the perspective, the skill set that it gives you, because, you've just put this whole book together with Doug. I'm curious, what does chess provide? I mean, you can only theorize. You might not know the story I just told you about, but what do you think they were thinking? What is it about chess that some famous traders would want the chess players? And what is it from your perspective that chess provides that's very useful in the world beyond just playing the game?
Well, I think it's a lot of different skills, but if you just want to pick out one, is the analytical skills. Because as a chess players, what we do in every single chess game or every single move that we decide on, we assess the situation that's ahead of us, taking into account the constant changes, dynamic of the game, because with every move there are tremendous changes to the position. Then we take disciplined analysis, try to, as much as we can, put our emotions aside and try to objectively analyze the situation, given all the different variables of the position as well as of our opponent. And then we have to make decisions. And we constantly practice this process of assessing a situation, analyzing it, and then making decisions. Can you imagine every single game typically takes, let's say, anywhere from 30 to 50 or even more moves. And that's just one single game. So a chess player is very well trained in that own thought process of analyzing and making decisions. And a lot of people out there, while they may have excellent knowledge and skills in a certain field, let's say in investing, they are afraid making decisions. They are unsure of themselves. They are indecisive, or they get too emotional about it. And I think chess players, that's what we train ourselves in controlling those emotions. Obviously, we're all humans, and naturally, we need to deal with controlling the emotions. So I think all those things that can contribute in the world of finance as well to good qualities, or to have extra experience that, let's say, a non-chess player would not have.
You know, given your success, it's pretty clear that you've had a very good handle on your own emotions, handling your emotions, controlling your emotions, however you want to phrase it, most of your life. But was there ever a time where you look back and you say, my emotions got the best of me? Can you recall one, or do you not look at it that way?
Well, obviously, I'm human as well. I'm no exception to that, and nobody wins it all. You know, whether we're talking about in the stock market or in a chess competition, everybody loses, including Garry Kasparov or Magnus Carlsen. Obviously, we just want to minimize the frequency of those occasions, and certainly, I had my share of them, and there were situations, whether for personal reasons or another reason, you know, I couldn't control my emotion as well as I wanted to. Fortunately, I can say that more often than not, I managed to control it and not to interfere with my thought process and analysis and good results.
Since you just mentioned him, I'm curious, mentioning Kasparov, try and help us mere chess mortals to understand from, you know, here you are, Grandmaster level, you know, one of the best, but he's even higher. So from your perspective, just pretend I'm another Grandmaster that you're talking to. What do you look at somebody like Kasparov and admire? What did he have, or up and above beyond where you got to? What was that extra bit that he had up and above that you looked to and said, wow?
I think, first of all, his drive. I know Gary very well. He is a super driven person, period. Not just a chess player. He is extra emotional and motivated and focused towards his goals. When he was still competing, obviously extra hard working, and he also had the right circumstances in that he was, as he liked to call himself, the child of change back in the Soviet Union era, where he was representing kind of that anti-communist group, and he had a group of grandmasters helping him because it's very rare when somebody can succeed just on his own. There are a couple exceptions, perhaps, in the world of chess. He had a good team also, and that's certainly a great ingredient to the success. But he obviously was one of the greatest players of all times, and the energy level that he had, and to some degree still has for different missions that he's involved today, it's really admirable, his energy level that he's you can feel when he enters in a room that he has that super driven, energy full person that's quite rare.
You know, I can hear the admiration for him in your voice, but, you know, in your book, you go into a very famous match that he was involved in with Deep Blue. Could you explain that story and your perspective, what you learned from his match with Deep Blue?
Well, obviously, that's a very important match in our world, not just in the chess world, but I think in the whole human versus the silicon on the computer. I was there at the match personally, actually observing it, several of the games while it was played in New York City back in the mid-90s. Growing up, being a few years younger than Gary, but following his statements back in the early mid-80s, he stated that a computer will never defeat humans in chess. While years later, he modified it. Well, computers will never defeat humans in my lifetime. to the point where he had to concede that he was defeated. And basically today we all have to recognize already for years now that basically the top software that even the top humans are no competition for the top chess software programs, because they simply don't blunder. We humans, we make mistakes time to time, and doesn't matter if it's even just one mistake, the computer will take advantage of it every single time. So that human element that we humans, we make mistakes while the computer doesn't. On a long term, in a 10-game match, pretty much today, it will always come out ahead. But it's if you think of it, though, it's really remarkable that basically the artificial intelligence side of science developed that high. That because it's not all calculation, it's the humans who program Deep Blue and then eventually other software. They have to put in a lot of variables that are not as concrete, although they try to translate it for the computer to be more tangible. It's quite remarkable that field of programmers, managed to develop those algorithms that supposedly abstract concepts like occupying an open file or the pair of bishops or the attack on the king, that are relatively abstract concepts for humans. They manage to translate it in a language of computers, and it's quite fascinating, actually. And I think that is why, one of the reasons why today in a lot of universities they use chess programming as one of the tools to teach future programmers in the how to write programs and algorithms, because it's a real fascinating field. And by no means I'm an expert in that field on the other side of it, on the programming side of it, but I'm very impressed. And actually in my lifetime, just like in Gary's, we went from the stage. I remember my very first chess computer that I got, the Boris Diplomat, that I could beat even as a child in every single game. It developed to the stage that it's very hard to win a game against a computer.
Yeah, it is fascinating. I look at the world that I'm in, the trading world, and I've made a point here that I want to bring up with you from something from your book. The idea of not fixating on winning the game, but focusing on the move that will improve your position the most, basically process versus outcome. And in the trading and investing world, I think that the comparison is apt. I mean, it's right there. It's not about thinking about the ultimate victory or the win or the end of the game or the big pot of gold at the end. You have to take each step with the right process. And some of the outcomes might not go your exact way, but you still have to take the right process each time.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what I tell my students at Webster University, which is the number one ranked team in the country for several years now, that don't worry about the result. The result will come as long as you put in the work and you have the right process, which we talked about earlier, the assessment, the analysis, and then coming to your conclusions. Worry about that, because that will help you control your emotions as well. If you're busy focusing on the task at hand, your next move, your very next move, and you cannot control really the result because there are just so many variables. You have an opponent, you have various circumstances that can influence that. What you can control is to make sure that you are focusing on the task at the very hand, right? Your next move.
Yeah, and right in line with that thinking is something else from the book. If you blunder, don't give up fighting, meaning you're going to have losses.
Exactly, and that's my other teaching moment always, that we all make mistakes, and there's nothing you can do to change the past, whether it's in a chess game or with a wrong investment strategy or move that you had in the stock market. And basically, since you cannot change the past, focus on the future, focus on what's still left in the game, and do the best you can to save the savable. Maybe you can no longer win that game, but you can draw the game, not lose the game, which is much better than losing.
I've only got you for a few more minutes, Susan. I'm curious, though, if you could also maybe give some for the audience out there, and obviously there's different types of people in my audience, but the decision tree type thinking. And I think sometimes, whether it's in chess or investing, people, they don't think through the possibilities. They don't think about the, as Nassim Taleb would say, the black swan that might come in. Why don't you talk about the preparation and the practice that goes into, from a chess perspective, thinking through the possibilities?
Absolutely. And that's another big lesson that I teach at all levels, whether it's a beginner student or even a grandmaster student, that it's always absolutely important to consider the other side. You cannot just think from your perspective. You always need to look at what your opponent is trying to do, because just like in many other fields in our lives, in chess as well, we have an opponent. We have a rival. And obviously that person has an opposite interest than we do. They want to win, just like we do. And in order to come to an educated decision, objectively good decision, we need to put our other hat on, our opponent's hat, and think, what would we do if we were on that side? And we need to try as objectively as we can constantly and analyze that and look at it from that perspective. And for example, for beginners chess players, that's one of their biggest mistakes, and that's why they lose so many games or make so many mistakes, because they only think from their sides that, okay, I'm going here, I'm going there, and I'm trying to checkmate my opponent, not thinking what the other side will do. So when I have a beginner or intermediate student, that's one of the biggest focuses, that we need to engrave that mindset in a young chess player or a beginner chess player, that every single move, and there can be no exception, every single move that other person, we need to think what that other person or the other side would be the best, according to our judgment, can do. And we alter our moves and our decisions accordingly.
Let me end it with one kind of fun question, something that I've read about that you took on, a challenge. You played, was it 326 people at the same time?
Yes, I did. That was back about 10 years ago, actually. It was a world record at the time. That was one long day. I played all those games continuously for over 17 hours, and it involved over 9 miles of walking in Palm Beach Garden, Florida, at the mall. So that was a fun experience.
Is there anything that any of us mere mortals can take from that experience that you had? Is there a lesson of playing 326 people in chess at the same time? Is there a lesson for me, Mike?
Well, be physically fit, because it's a lot of walking, and it takes a lot of drive and endurance and focus and concentration.
Yeah. Hey, listen, thank you for joining me today. Hey, did I read this correct, though? Is your husband's Vietnamese?
Yes, he is.
I'm in Saigon tonight.
Oh, you are?
Yes, I am.
I've been there. We've been there last summer. It's great. Enjoy.
Yeah.
The food is amazing there.
Oh, the food's the best, right? It's great. Well, listen, thank you for taking the time today. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.
What's the nexus? How do you get the idea? You know, you're a certified financial planner. How do you get the idea to connect chess? And I, as a little background for myself, and I say connect chess to investing, I have not played since I was a kid, but I'm very respectful of the thought process every time I read a chess article. And I know that if I had the time and the patience and all that stuff, I know there's a tremendous number of lessons in chess. So why don't you explain to me, how did you start to have this idea of chess and investing, connecting the two, chess as a metaphor, investing, and connecting with Susan? How did this happen?
I had been thinking of this for a long time because as a financial planner, I'd always been interested in the strategic side of things. But it really came up when two of my kids are chess champions. And, when your kid's a champion at something, you get them a private coach. I used to sit in on their sessions, and one day I was sitting in with my daughter and her coach, Boris, on their coaching session, and we were doing a post-mortem on a game that I had actually played. Boris said, Doug, why didn't you move your bishop, from here to there? So I said, well, I was busy doing something else. I was going to work on another side of the board. Then the next move, he said, listen, Doug, you saw your bishop was in a bad place. Why didn't you change it? And I said, well, this time I wanted to do something else. And this went on a couple of moves until I finally realized that I sounded exactly like my clients when I'll tell them, listen, Mr. Smith, why don't you change this investment or do that? And he says, well, I'm busy with something else at the moment. And it turned out that that was kind of a revelation to me. And then I began writing down all of the tidbits of wisdom and the ideas, the real strategies the chess coach was giving us. And I noticed time and time again, they were all exactly the same things that I would say to clients.
So you were sitting there attempting or giving excuses, and he was basically coming back at you and saying, hey, hold on. The right move is this. The expectation is that. The possibilities, the odds are this. Why are you not paying attention? Essentially, right?
Exactly. And something, everyone needs a coach. So in the same way that people need financial coaches and chess coaches, and Tiger Woods needs probably a golf coach also, I think people need to have a little outside perspective. But it just turns out, at least in my research, and then what ultimately happened was when I spoke with Susan Polgar about this, it just turns out that there's so many areas of overlap between chess and investing. And of course, from a marketing standpoint, I think people really do understand that chess grandmasters are probably amongst the very top strategic thinkers in the world. So real benefit to be able to learn from their knowledge.
Let me jump into something that you mentioned that I did not know you were going to mention at the beginning, which is 2 kids going down this path. The ages of your kids and the male, female, both girls, what are we talking?
Actually, I have 4 kids. 2 of them became real chess heroes. 2 of them are fantastic chess players, but didn't compete. But it happened because when we used to live in a very small town, and when my daughter's now 21, when she was 5 years old, I was walking down the street, and I was a young father at the time. This older Russian couple, I don't know if they seemed old to me at the time. They were probably like 40, but when I was young, that seemed like pretty old. And we're walking down the street, and they say, what a cute little girl. And Boris says, how old is your daughter? I said, she's 5. And he said, well, it's time she starts learning chess. And then Anna, his Russian wife, said, and it is time she starts learning piano. And so the next day, Boris started teaching her chess, and Anna started teaching her piano.
The 2 children that have become very proficient now as adults, but how old were they? So you're 5, and how was the second one's age starting?
Boris said children start chess at 5.
5.
He was
okay.
A very demanding coach.
Interesting. Did he tell you why 5? What is there something about 5? That's generally kindergarten.
I don't know. I know that with Susan Polgar, my co-author, for people who are in the chess world, her name is, she's known as of the 3 Polgar sisters. And their father, they were brought up in communist Hungary, and their father had this whole concept that genius could be taught. It wasn't necessarily genetic. And you have to understand, Michael, this is 40, 50 years ago that he was thinking this. Today, it's a popular concept, the 10,000-hour rule and this type of thing that people can work hard. But imagine being this radical thinker in Hungary, and you want to homeschool your kids in chess. It was crazy at the time. But he ultimately proved it by showing that people, as early as 4, that's when she won her first championship.
But here's where I'm going, is before I even get to Susan, and I'm coming to her, I'm curious about you, because you're going down this path with 2 children, becoming very good, before you ever met Susan, right?
Sure.
So what was some of the things that you were seeing as a father? Because this is, if your 2 children become extremely proficient in chess, talk about what you saw. Talk about how you helped them, the practice they went through. Give me an idea of the regimen. Give me an idea of, obviously they liked it too, but talk to me about how that unfolded for them to become so good at it.
Well, one of the interesting things I found also was just having a boy and a girl. And I got to tell you, I'm what you call an avid chess player, which for people who are into wordsmithing realizes the word avid doesn't really mean much. It just sounds like you know what you're talking about. So I am not the world's greatest interpreter of chess, but I noticed when I would play against my daughter or against my son, they actually had different styles. And my son was more aggressive and my daughter was more positional. And the way that they really took to it, and I just tried to encourage them to focus on what their coach did, as any father would do. But I think that one of the things that the coach pointed out was that it's most important to work on tactics as opposed to strategy. I talk to people about strategy all the time and thinking of big picture, but at the end of the day, if you mess up on your tactics on the chessboard or with your money or probably any other endeavor in life, if you don't make each move carefully, you're going to end up being a loser.
How did you meet a grandmaster, Susan? How did that happen?
Like all chess students, we studied her games with Bobby Fischer, and when you study the greats, you study people like Susan Polgar. I actually also do a radio show, and my kid said, "Daddy, why don't you speak to Susan and ask her about your ideas?" So I just asked my producer. He got her on the phone, and she was very interested. As soon as I brought up this idea that I had been thinking, our interview was about 20 minutes, but then we must have spoken for another hour about the ideas, and then this just became huge. We began meeting all over the world because she travels a great deal to talk about the ideas.
And so how did you go down this process? Because it's interesting. I mean, as an author, I've not collaborated with anybody on a book, and you are the one that's having this idea of a book. I mean, maybe she's pondered the idea of a book just on chess alone, but you're seeing this connective tissue. Were you having to, I mean, was she thinking about the connective tissue in terms of investments at all, or were you kind of winning her over to this thought process?
I think the way it really ultimately ended up was I'd explained this theory that I'd been thinking about, and then I'll tell you an amazing thing about speaking with someone who is just such an incredible genius is that you can never really predict what they're going to say. With all due respect to most of the people I know, normally you have a conversation with someone, you kind of know where it's going. But with her, it was never like that. So then what I realized when I became a little more humble and was willing to become a better listener is I would talk to her about ideas in finance that I was dealing with, really mostly personal finance issues. And I would just ask an open-ended question. I would say, what does that remind you of? And she would either talk about games she played or stories she had or famous historical games. It wasn't all about, but we just used chess as the metaphor to illuminate the ideas.
I'm curious about chess and genius. For those people that don't play, so you hear grandmaster, we all kind of know that's important. We know that means something. Why don't you define grandmaster and talk a little bit about genius and perhaps Susan's genius and why you see it to the layperson that doesn't play or the person that even plays just a little bit, how to understand. Because look, I can look at a great athlete and I can say, wow, that guy just did a standing broad jump of 12 feet. And you can go, I get that. Because I could go try it myself and I'm not going to come close. But it's very difficult on something that's so cerebral to get inside and understand the genius. Do you see where I'm going?
Just technically, being a grandmaster means that the International Chess Organization recognizes you as having reached a very high level. It used to only be men, by the way. And this is interesting in other sports as well. If you ask how you can identify it, well, let me ask you a question. Let's say that you heard about a big chess tournament and you went to a mall and there was one woman playing against 326 people simultaneously. In the same way you'd say, wow, that was a cool broad jump, you might say, that's pretty impressive that she could do that. And she won almost every single game. They set up they needed a mall because it was so big. They set up 326 chess boards. I apologize if I'm getting the number wrong, but it was plus or minus a few. And she walked around and went from board to board and played against every single person. It took her about 17 hours, and she had to walk, I think, a total of around 9 miles, going around and around and around, just playing each person. And she won basically every game. She broke the Guinness Book of World Records with that one, let me tell you.
What's going on in the mind, though, at that point? I mean, clearly the rules of chess are very defined, so it's not like poker. You're not, you're very defined. So obviously she has worked on memory to a certain degree in a way that most of us mere mortals don't. But that's not necessarily something genetic. She has, I mean, I'm not going to discount the fact that there could be a genetic advantage there, but I'm going to give her credit and say it's more about practice. Talk about that notion of what does it even take to get to that point?
Because I've asked her, this is obviously a big topic, and people ask her and chess players a lot, how do you do that? The main issue, I think, is pattern recognition and chunking data. The term chunking actually was a Nobel Prize winning term. And I think that, and I'm sure, Michael, you do this as well, my expertise is in financial planning. If someone shows me his brokerage statement, I can look at it and instantly get an understanding of what's going on. If he's properly invested, I can probably tell you a lot about the client without even going much further. Why? It's because I've looked at thousands and thousands of statements and I understand the patterns that I'm looking for. I don't have to study each position and dive into it. And that's the same way that chess grandmasters will play a simultaneous game or play blindfolded. They can play multiple games sometimes without even looking at a single board. It's because they're seeing areas of power. They're seeing focus. They're seeing a much bigger picture. It's much more theoretical because they can't. I don't know if they can or can't, but they're not going to be able to memorize every piece on the board for every move. Instead, they see it as one big pattern as opposed to a lot of individual pieces.
Do you see in her, obviously you've developed a pretty good relationship, do you see in her the chess genius applying to other areas of life? Obviously, you've collaborated on this book, so there's clearly quite a bit of insight that she's able to power into the book, but about investing and whatnot. But do you see that chess genius applying in other areas?
Yeah, I think it has to do with the way that she'll learn something. When we would talk about any topic that maybe wasn't her expertise in the beginning, for example, certain financial issues, she would ask very good questions, and questions that I don't normally hear. And again, I hear a lot of questions just because of my day job. But she would ask very, very good questions and be able to interpret the answers, not just accurately, but creatively, and come up with new ideas. And putting ideas together, I think, is what makes someone a creative genius.
I'm somewhat putting you on the spot to try and recall an example, but I'm so curious because you've just kind of said something similar to what you said a few minutes ago, which is a conversation with her could go off in a way that you don't expect. And I'm looking to try and wrap my arms around, from your perspective, an example, something when you're having a conversation with her so the audience can appreciate this different style of thinking, this different style of analysis that you obviously came to have great respect for, and an example in her that you could maybe share.
I have a bad habit, which I will share with you, and I've been working on getting over it, but once I met her, I absolutely stopped it, which is I would sometimes help people finish their sentences. I don't know if you find this as well, but it's sort of and I would respect the fact that it's not, necessarily so polite, but, you're listening to someone and you hear he's searching for a word, so I would help him out and, to continue a conversation. So I remember having done this a few times with Susan also. What I realized is I would try to finish, help her along. Again, I not the nicest thing to do. I'm sorry I used to do this. But I would realize what I was thinking she was about to say. She would always say something totally different. At first, I thought she was kind of making a point to me, like, hey, Doug, don't finish my sentences. But it's simply because I didn't know what she was really thinking. And that was what was so great about working together, is she really brought a lot of new ideas to the table.
I've met a few people like that I've got to know personally, the extremely well-known traders. One that I can think of without naming, a very, very successful and extremely young age, in his early 20s, MIT math background. And I remember the first time I met him, there was almost a presence about him. And I don't say this in any kind of a hero worship way, but there was almost a presence about him that his economy of words, his efficiency, the way he started to go down a path, and you're like, this guy's different. This guy's not working with the same deck that we're all coming from. And it influenced me terribly to watch how he did it. And I think one of the things, and maybe you'll agree with me, I think that and I'm sure they learn this, but maybe they're better at dealing with their fears. And so when they're better at dealing with their fears, maybe they're willing to be more direct and more honest and more transparent. And we all instantly get it. I mean, when Susan would tell you something where you would realize, wow, she's looking at that perspective. You would get it immediately, but then you sit back and you go, God, I wish I was looking at it from that perspective from the beginning too. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's true. One of the reasons actually in the book we included a lot of stories of her life, just anecdotes that she would tell, is A, because people like the stories, but B, you could just see how she would take a problem and look at it differently. And it's very exciting to be around people like that, I find.
I got one last question for you. And this one is not related to the book, but I kind of caught it. I think I caught you on a podcast somewhere else. And I heard this and I was like, we have something in common. And you mentioned doing a radio show podcast. You mentioned that you thought you had interviewed, I'm not sure how far back, or if you said all living Nobel Prize winners in econ. Did you say that?
I said not all. I said almost all, because we tried to get him. It was embarrassing. I said to my producer, get this guy. I forget who it was. And then he comes back and goes, Doug, he's dead. So,
I did the same thing, actually.
It was terrible. I'd read the book, and it was interesting. And what turns out, a terrible thing about the Nobel Prize Committee is they are very, very, very slow at appreciating someone's work. You win a prize for work you might have done 30 or 40 years ago, by which time you're old already. And, you don't. And so by the time you're recognized for being great, that you don't get to enjoy that time very much. Yeah, but I see you also, by the way. I'm noting you have some of the world's greatest guests on your show.
I'm at 4 Nobel Prize winners in econ. So at Robert Aumann, Vernon Smith, Harry Markowitz, and Daniel Kahneman. And so I'm going to have to go back and poke through your life and see what trail you've gone down, because clearly once you start interviewing Nobel Prize winners as somebody who's doing a show, you're kind of like, well, gosh, I need the next one, right?
Yeah, I'll tell you a good story about Aumann was the first.
Yeah.
He was the first one I talked to. What a great guy.
Yeah.
And then I spoke to Kahneman. And this was around the time when Susan and I were beginning working on our book. So I was telling him about the ideas, and he was very interested. A big part of our book is on behavioral finance. And one of the things that we discovered was, I always describe it to people as the study of why people make poor investment decisions even when they know the right thing to do. So I think it encapsulates it. So I was discussing this with Kahneman, who won his Nobel Prize for his research in behavioral finance. And I said, and Susan and I have discovered parallels in chess. And he said, that's very interesting, Doug. I'd like to see your chapter on that. Michael, you can imagine how excited I was. I'm going to get to submit the chapter to a Nobel Prize winner. I sent it off to him. 2 months later, he gets back to me, and I was so excited I was going to get his review of our analysis of behavioral finance. The only thing he was interested in reviewing was the chess analysis. Turns out he's also a chess genius, and he had questions about a chess game. Nothing to I guess it means he accepted our behavioral finance concepts.
It's tough because I think people do want to, bringing them together is a real synthesis, a real combination that's original to put that together. And I can see how very smart people probably want to pick and choose what they might want in particularly. It's really interesting also about the Nobel Prize winners, the 4 that I've had on my show, all over the age of 80, all perfectly lucid. I mean, when I call Harry Markowitz, who I think is 85, when I call him and he picks up his phone in San Diego County, it's like, hello, Michael, how are you doing today? And you're just like, is this guy 85 or is he 25? It's crazy. So,
yeah.
Listen, hey, where can we send people, Doug? Where's the best place for everyone to go?
I guess the best thing is for people to go to the website for the book, which is richasaking.com.
Doug, I appreciate you coming on today. I think it's a terribly interesting combination. Nice bit of creativity to bring it together. Congratulations.
Michael, thanks so much.
Thank you. I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.